So I guess the first place to start is why? Why this exhibition and why now?
Gosh, I know, I can't believe, Nick, it's been only, I think, less than a year then when we first began talking about the exhibition. And I suppose it was born out of a frustration for me in terms of the fact that when an item of clothing comes into the Metropolitan Museum, or any museum, you can't wear it anymore, you can't hear it, you can't smell it, you can't touch it. So the only sense you're left with is a sense of sight, enhanced in a museum. And the great thing about clothing being in a museum is that you can look at the construction, you can analyse the construction, the details. So the sort of virtuosity of the craftsmanship really comes to the fore, but the other senses are very much lost. So in a way, it's always been frustrating for me, and I suppose for any museum fashion curator, that the intentionality of clothing, the fact that it was intended to be worn, intended to be seen in movement, is very much lost in the museum. So it was really born out of that. And I know, it's something you've done so beautifully at SHOWstudio, which is why the collaboration was so exciting for me and for my colleagues at the museum, because a lot of the ideas that we hope to explore in the show you'd already explored through SHOWstudio, really, since the early 2000s. So it seemed a really nice meeting of minds. One of my favorite parts of my job is collaborating. We've collaborated with Wong Kar-wai, Baz Luhrmann, so to me, that's really exciting because I learn so much from my collaborators and it really advances my practice. And with designers, just hearing them talk about the process. And it's one of the things that is so extraordinary about SHOWstudio in terms, very early on, you focused on process and focused on a designer's process, and you really forefronted that. And I think it's the potential to be one of those like paradigm shifting exhibitions. I really do, in terms of the fact that, often technology in museums is secondary. It's always something that is in the background, so to speak. And the fact that we've integrated technology into the actual structure of the exhibition, and that we're using it to animate and reawaken these costumes. So I think it's really exciting for me, and I think even going forwards, it's just the beginning. I know that we've only had such a short time to do it, and there's many things we would have done if we had more time. But I see it as a moment where, even going forwards, I want to record any dress that comes into the museum. I want to record in an anechoic chamber. So we have that data, and also the idea of smell. So I want to create new databases, around clothing within museum context because of this exhibition. So I think it's just the beginning, and it's very short term, but I think the long-term consequences of this show could be huge in terms of museum exhibitions. The fact that it's sensorially open, it's more participatory, it's more interconnected. I always feel as if you've got to seduce people visually before you can seduce them intellectually. So for me, it's really important that it looks beautiful and that it's compelling. So when you first walk in, it's this extraordinary experience, and then you can, if you want to, you can access more of the intellectual and the conceptual idea behind it. But I think if you lose people visually, you're not going to engage them.
It's actually a very poetic exhibition. And it works on many different levels, but it starts with a Brancusi head. Brancusi is one of my favourite sculptures, it's a beautiful piece of his, but why did you choose that as the opening frame, the first thing people see? What does that mean in terms of how people would expect the exhibition then to unroll?
It's become the mascot of the exhibition in a way, because the idea for the garments within the show, not all of them, is to reawaken them through the senses. So this idea of garments being in a state of slumber in the museum's archives, which is what they are. And in a way, it's sleep is a salve between restoration, and it allows us, but it's also equivocates between life and death and any sleep. So we have these garments in the museum slumbering in this perpetual slumber, and the fact that we're able to sort of open the Brancusi's eyes temporarily in the space of 4 months, I thought was really beautiful. So it has become this sort of mascot for the exhibition. It's so complex. I think it's probably one of the most complex shows we've ever done. But I suppose the short answer is that we're hoping to reawaken costumes in the archive through the senses. As soon as an item of clothing is born, it's sort of dead, because it's going to be taken over by the next cycle, like technology. So I do think that this idea of nature is incredible. It does bring together the tech side of it, the fashion side of it, the theme of it, the senses. It sort of coalesced everything so beautifully, and we never intended that to begin with, did we? We ended up there through osmosis, I suppose.
And tell me a little bit about, because I think a lot of people don't understand how a piece of clothing becomes part of the Met collection, nor I'm sure they don't understand that once it becomes part of the Met collection, then it can't be touched. It can't be, worn, obviously, all those sorts of things. So it's very much, so once it's in the Met, it's preserved. But how do you go about finding a piece? Do you think, okay, I've got a theme of a show, and this show is about nature and tech, say, so therefore I know that dress by Hussein Schlein, or I know that dress by, whoever, Alexander McQueen, and do you go hunting those dresses?
We do. I mean, in terms of exhibitions, we do. We try to do exhibitions where the base of the exhibition is from our collection, and then we use the exhibitions as a reason to acquire pieces we've always wanted but haven't been able to get. For me, it's really about designers who push the boundaries of fashion and, in a way, change the trajectory of fashion through one way or another. With Issei or with Alai, it was about technique, as you know, and Charles James. It was about this almost fetishistic idea of technique being refined and refined and refined. Then you have someone like Ray, for example, who's more conceptual. Then you have someone like Lee, who's both. He's an extraordinary technician and an extraordinary conceptualist. But all of them change how you feel and think about fashion, whether about the body or a particular, something more cultural, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity. Designers who I feel are sort of changing fashion and changing the trajectory of fashion. Even, people like Chanel, she changed the trajectory of fashion through her vocabulary and this incredible way of the semiotics of marketing, which is ingenious. We're still doing it now. It's a very hands-on exhibition in a way, in terms of all your senses. In some capacities throughout the whole show are going to be activated. So I would say it's about reawakening costumes in the collection and resuscitating their sensorial qualities.
The first piece is exactly that. It's a reawakening of a Charles Worth dress?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
From which date?
The late 1880s. It was owned by the daughter of the Mrs. Astor, who famously had her ballroom in New York, and it was the daughter who wore it, and it's an extraordinary Charles Frederick Worth dress. The complexity of the construction is remarkable.
So in the first exhibit is bringing the dress back to life. I think that's a really lovely way to start it, and I think it is worth talking about. And you and I, before we got on camera, were talking about the amount of work that came from both the conservators at the Met and from my team here, a new plane, because it isn't just, as you were saying, it's not just how the material moves as material, it's how the combinations of material affect each other, but also how the structure of it and how the petticoats underneath or the corsetry, all that sort of thing. All of that's been taken into account in recreating this dress and movement.
But it is exactly that, Nick. It's sort of, this is a garment that is so fragile that it can no longer even be shown on a mannequin. So the only way to show this dress is flat. So you don't even get the dimensionality of the body. And oddly enough, it held a really sort of special place in my heart, because when I was at the V&A in London, it was a piece that I remember seeing in Harold's and Richard's Haute Couture exhibition. The iconicity of the dress and the iconography of it is so specific. But it's beautiful and one of his masterpieces. So I always wanted to see it. And when I got the job at the Met and I saw it in the archive, and I was horrified by its state. It suffers from something called warp loss. So it's the warp part of the textile, of the satin, has suffered sort of catastrophic loss, but the weft parts are still very much in touch. So it almost looks like cobwebs now, and it's inherent. It has inherent vice, which is something which is an inherent quality of a garment, a textile that it's in a way creates its own ruin, its own self-destruction. No matter what we do to it, we can't repair it and we can't bring it back to life. So in a way, technology was the only way of bringing it back to life.
We photographed the dress lying flat, so we get some idea of the texture of it and the shine and all those sorts of things, and to get some sort of photographic record just of the surfaces of it. And then we started back with a pattern. I think one of the conservators drew the pattern, is that right?
It's taken 9 months.
Yeah.
If you think about where we started, as you say, it's a pattern making, then you guys had to digitally transform it into a digital pattern, and then the scanning that all you guys did, and I don't think people realise the complexity of what's gone into it.
I don't think any of us realised the complexity.
We didn't.
Nobody in this whole venture realised how detailed it can be, but how much better it is for the detail. I think Tom really fell in love with getting the knowledge about that dress. Because otherwise you're given a pattern of a dress to recreate, but there's no context, there's no understanding of fashion, there's no understanding of the materiality or the pattern or anything. It's a very, we've had the privilege to have some of the greatest minds at the Met working on this dress. And it does, again, we were talking before we got on air, that the first time that this dress would have had that much, was when it was created.
This is a garment that visitors would never see because it can't be shown on a mannequin. So it's only scholars probably could see it in the doors of the museum. Now we've created, in a way, its avatar that people can appreciate in perpetuity. And the fact that we've recorded it now at this point, and it's so the value of something that I think we've created is invaluable, because we're recording material that will continue to deteriorate.
In the exhibition itself sounds very important. Another term like inherent vice, which you told me at the beginning of this, was scroop. Could you tell me?
Well, yes, scroop is mainly, it's the sound of silk, basically. So taffeta has a much louder scroop than a sort of silk crepe, for example.
Right.
The undergarments or the understructures you would wear would also enhance the level of scroop. So your corset or your pannier or crinoline would also enhance the level of scroop, and how you sit and how you sort of navigate a furnished space would also heighten your scroop. So in a way, I love the idea that a woman would be wearing a dress and she was in control of her own sort of auditory impact. It was part of the, I should imagine, part of the etiquette of 18th and 19th century in terms of, controlling your level of scroop in terms of how you relate to people. It's so interesting, and all of that's lost in fashion.
And is that something that was part of the selling point of the dress? If somebody was selling a dress, would they say to the potential buyer, this has a very high scroop level, madam?
I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but yes, it was. We've seen advertisements from the 19th century which talk about the level of scroop, and the higher the scroop, the more expensive the fabric. So it definitely was a selling device in the 19th century. Right. It's fascinating because normally we have a soundtrack for our shows, and I always want to make people cry, so I always use sort of music that is sort of stirring. But this time it's just the sound of the clothes you're going to hear, or the smell of the clothes you're going to smell. So as you go through the show, the only music we have actually, Nick, is for the Pepper's Ghost.
Right.
Because we needed that for it to show in terms of how she danced. But all the others, you're going to just hear the scroop, or you're going to hear Alexander McQueen's razor clamshell dress moving, or Francesco's tin flower dress moving. So it's very much focused on the dresses themselves and its sensorial impact on the audience.
But you also have, and one of the, I think, really beautiful exhibits in the show is Simon Costin's Thorn.
The neck piece, the one that's based on The Nightingale and the Rose.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, it's a story about a student who was in love with this girl, and he couldn't afford a rose, and the nightingale basically sacrifices itself. So she pours out her blood to get the perfect red rose, but he then gives to
so she flies into the briar bush.
Into the bush and basically kills herself. It's a sort of suicide attempt, and and then the student gets the rose, and the girl he's trying to pursue is rather avaricious, so the rose wasn't enough, so he ends up throwing the rose into the gutter, and it's so tragic, and it's
I didn't know that part of it. I thought he won a heart.
No, it wouldn't be so nice, wouldn't it? No, the girl wanted more than just a rose.
With a bird in it.
Yeah, it was a poor bird. As always, Simon's captured the sort of melancholy of the story, but also the melancholy of nature. And I love what you wrote in your epilogue, Nick, in terms of, because I tend to romanticize nature, and you quite rightly said it's brutal. It's really about its own survival, and there's a sort of very brutal aspect of fashion. It is the summation of the exhibition in terms of the beauty, the romance, but also the brutality and the sort of harshness of nature.
There's another also really beautiful piece, a poem. Could you remind me the name of the poem and the poet in the Crashing Waves moment?
Well, Mami Wata,
That's the one,
it's really interesting because it was T.B. Magugu, the wonderful South African designer, created a garment, and the actual print itself is based on the Great Hurricane of 1780 in the West Indies, which is the most catastrophic sort of hurricane in the history of ever. And he based it on a particular French engraving, which is the print you see on the actual garment, which is in the middle of the gallery. And I think with the Crashing Waves that you recorded, it wasn't in Cornwall, was it?
Just at the end of last year, there was a huge storm that came to Europe, and I had a house in Cornwall, so I went down to Cornwall, but I've also been going down to Nazaré in Portugal and filming the waves crashing there as part of another project, but I couldn't be in two places at once. So I asked Britt Lloyd, who's a filmmaker I've worked with over the years, who's brilliant, to go down to Nazaré for me. So I was on a cliff top in Portugal, and she was on a beach in Nazaré. But in Nazaré, you get the 100-foot wave.
Incredible.
I used to visit her in her cottage by the sea, my grandmother. She spun silky stories of a creature some had seen and one that swam in streams.
Just in front of Nazaré, on the beach in Nazaré, it dips right down and comes up very sharply. So the waves go down and they hit the top wave and it creates this huge explosion of water. So that's where Britt went and filmed the crashing waves.
I love also how the next gallery that we have is more of the serenity of the underwater, with the sequence. So you get the violence of nature in one aspect of the show, and then you move into the next gallery, which is more about the tranquility and the sort of reflective and meditative idea of nature.
Yeah,
so I think that's a nice transition.
It is very interesting because you get that in nature. On top of the water, it's all sort of chaos and turbulence, and underneath, it's all calm. So there's that very nice thing.
Lovely.
One of the rooms that we talked about right at the beginning, which I think is beautiful and very poignant and actually also very tragic, is the Swallows room. That was one of the first ideas you told me about. Should we just go through it? Do you want to explain that?
Well, it's amazing, because that was probably the first one we thought about, wasn't it?
Yeah.
And that one, it hasn't changed. I mean, others have changed along the way, but this is the only one that hasn't really changed. And it was, oddly enough, it's changed a little bit in terms of the garments, because originally we had the Madeleine Vionnet dress in the middle. And the Madeleine Vionnet dress, it was created just before the outbreak of the Second World War. Yeah. And it's a black tulle dress with swallows, black swallows, embroidered onto the tulle in both matte and shiny sequins. So it catches the light beautifully. But it's also very prophetic. It's all about the notion of death, juxtaposed with Lee McQueen's jacket from his Birds collection, which was inspired by Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds. And it's changed a little bit in terms of now that's going to be in the center of the space, because we felt with your animation, it worked better with a sort of like ominous idea of hearing one bird, then two birds and three birds. So it becomes this Hitchcockian moment of birds flying around. But what's so nice about it too is, because the show is about the senses, but it's also about emotion. So the idea of going into that space and feeling the fear of that Tippi Hedren would have had in the film is extraordinary. So I think that, as well as it being a sensorial experience, I think as you go through the exhibition, it's going to be very emotional, hopefully, for people. And these animations will trigger emotions that perhaps you weren't expecting.
Yeah, and I remember telling Tom when we were sort of trying to work out how the birds should appear. I said it should look like a Hitchcock film. Hitchcock's films aren't linear. They always take you back and forward. Just when you think something else happens. So we had to program the swallows to be Hitchcockian. Even
the music you guys have found, because Tom was saying he's found the music that was originally it's in an archive somewhere in Berlin.
In Berlin, yeah.
It's amazing.
I think it's a real eye-opener for me of the fantastic, detail you can put into these things. Because a swallow has a particular way of flying. It's different from an owl, or different from an eagle, or different from a sparrow. It has a particular motion to it. It's balletic, and you have to get that feeling. So all those sorts of things need specialist research.
We've never done a show quite so immersive as this. So I think it's the first time we've done a show where it's truly and properly immersive, as opposed to something that is a little bit more atmospheric.
I think what you made very clear to me is the films had to expand on the clothes. They couldn't just be a sort of, here's a picture of a woman wearing this in 1920 and here's a dress. Fine. But actually what I hope we've achieved is this idea that we've taken things further. You have the amazing YSL Van Gogh jacket, the irises, which we've remade, and it's 40,000 digital sequins and beads on it, which have all been placed.
Amazing.
So you see that. Of course, you can go close to the garment because it's in the exhibition, but when you see it coming down to you, almost like the sort of ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, coming down, you see the light reflecting on each one of them. You really sort of go from being just looking at a piece of clothing and understanding that to the sense of that piece of clothing. Almost the sort of what Van Gogh would have wanted with his irises.
One of the challenges I think we had to begin with was, the sense of sight is something, people can look at a garment, but how can we really make them look at a garment and showing an aspect of a garment, either its construction or detailing, embroidery, that you perhaps may not focus on immediately. So the animations, which I think are so incredible, they're almost like microscopes. You know, they allow you these macroscopic sort of understandings of a clothing that you wouldn't really have normally, but immersive. So you're literally walking into the garment and you're walking into the embroidery of, in this particular case, Saint Laurent's Iris's jacket, but I think also the connection that you've made with the sort of three-dimensionality of the embroidery, but also the three-dimensionality of Van Gogh's paint. Sometimes he would be painting en plein air and a pebble would like go onto the paint, he'd just leave it in because it was so dimensional. And I think that aspect of sort of marrying three-dimensionality of Yves Saint Laurent's embroidery, the Lesage embroidery, with Van Gogh's painting process, and it's really interesting. Again, just what you said, putting light on it has made a big difference, because again, it'd be a very one specific light in the exhibition, but the fact that you have light on the embroidery, you see it very differently, and it's a way of heightening your sense of sight.
But in the middle of the exhibition, you have this beautiful yellow room with these incredible, garments which are all dyed with woad. Is that right?
Weld. I think
weld.
What's so nice about it is this sort of like chromatic sort of analysis, because we start off with weld, which was from the weld plant, which was used to develop natural yellow in the 18th and 19th century, before aniline dyes were introduced. So we start from this we start from weld and this natural dye towards the introduction of synthetic dye, and then we end with designers like Phoebe English, who's sort of again working with weld natural dyes at the end. So it's a sort of like complete circle. It's exactly what the show is about, because we focused on nature as this ultimate metaphor for fashion. In a way, it's about fashion's rebirth and renewal, but also notions of ephemerality and impermanence, and the sort of transitory aspect of fashion, but also the transitory element of nature. So again, where we started off, because initially we just thought we'd activate masterworks in our collection through the senses, and then slowly, when I was working on the curation, and I literally went through 33,000, the entire collection, to decide which garments to activate. But because there's such a richness of garments inspired by the natural world, it sort of made sense that the through line of the exhibition is nature, because of its connection to technology too. Technology is all about ephemerality and impermanence. So the idea that nature is a sort of metaphor for both fashion and technology is interesting.
It is quite a brave step, especially how sort of volatile people feel about AI at the moment.
I think AI, you have to work with it to get the best results. It has been used and will continue to be used for incredibly negative reasons. But it does help creativity, and if it's used the right way, the potential is extraordinary.